Picture this. A woman is screaming. Not from pain. She cannot feel pain anymore. She is screaming because she is watching herself disappear. Her fingers are dissolving into the crocodile jaws of a creature crouched beneath a golden scale. The beast's lion body tenses as it swallows. Her memories are being consumed. Every moment she ever lived. Her first kiss. Her children's faces. The sound of her mother's voice. All of it sliding down into oblivion. Her name is being erased from existence. Not just forgotten, erased, as if the syllables themselves are being unwritten from the fabric of reality. In 30 seconds, she will be gone. Not dead. She was already dead. Gone. Completely and permanently gone. As if she had never existed at all. Her husband will not meet her in the afterlife. Her children will not recognize her in the field of reeds. There will be no her to recognize. The creature finishes swallowing. It licks its lips with a tongue that has tasted 10,000 souls. It turns its head toward the next person in line, and it waits. That creature had a name. The Egyptians called her Ammit, the Devourer, the Eater of Hearts, and for 3,000 years, she was the most terrifying figure in human religious imagination. Not because she tortured the wicked for eternity. That would almost be merciful. She did something far worse. She deleted them. Before we descend into the darkness of Egyptian death magic, if you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories of what our ancestors believed awaited them after the final breath, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you are listening from tonight. It still amazes me that we can explore these ancient mysteries together, connected across continents and time zones by shared curiosity about the biggest question any human being will ever face: what happens when we die? The ancient Egyptians thought they knew the answer, and they spent 3,000 years developing the most comprehensive system of death preparation the world has ever seen. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. We call it the Book of the Dead. It was not a book of philosophy. It was not a collection of prayers. It was a survival manual, an instruction guide for navigating the most dangerous journey any soul would ever take. A cheat sheet for the final exam that determined whether you would spend eternity in paradise or be erased from existence by a monster with crocodile jaws. This is the story of how that manual came to exist, how it evolved from royal privilege to mass-market product, how it shaped a civilization's understanding of morality, justice, and the meaning of human life, and how its insights about death and judgment cast shadows that stretch all the way to the present day. The story begins not with a book, but with a body. The year is approximately 2345 BC. A pharaoh named Unas lies dying in his palace at Memphis. He is the last ruler of Egypt's 5th dynasty, an old man who has reigned for 30 years over a kingdom that stretches from the Mediterranean to the cataracts of the Nile. His physicians have done everything they know how to do. His priests have recited every healing spell in their repertoire. Nothing has worked. The living God is about to stop living. But Unas is not afraid. At least, not afraid of death itself. He is afraid of what comes after. Because unlike modern people who might imagine death as either peaceful oblivion or automatic transport to some vaguely defined better place, Unas knows exactly what awaits him. His priests have told him. His entire life has been preparation for this moment. And what awaits him is not peace. It is a gauntlet. The instant his heart stops beating, his soul will leave his body and find itself standing at the entrance to the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a vast realm of darkness stretching beneath the earth, populated by demons, guarded by gates, and filled with dangers that would make the worst nightmares of the living seem like pleasant dreams. He will have to navigate this realm for 12 hours. 12 hours of monsters and trials and impossible challenges. And at the end, if he survives, he will face judgment before Osiris, the Lord of the Dead, who will determine whether Unas deserves to live forever among the gods or be fed to the Devourer. Unas has one advantage that no Egyptian before him has ever possessed. He has prepared something special for his tomb, something that will change the history of human religion forever. For years, his craftsmen have been carving hieroglyphic inscriptions into the walls of his burial chamber. Not decorative motifs, not records of his military victories or building projects, spells. Hundreds of magical formulas designed to protect his soul during the journey through the underworld. Words of power that will allow him to transform into a falcon and fly past dangers. Passwords that will force demonic gatekeepers to let him pass. Secret names of gods that will compel them to offer assistance. Every piece of information his priests could gather about surviving death, carved permanently into stone where it can never be lost, never be stolen, never decay. When Unas finally dies and his mummified body is placed in that chamber, he will be surrounded by magic. The spells will activate, the words will come to life, and his soul will have access to an arsenal of supernatural weapons that will give him every possible advantage in the trials ahead. These were the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings ever discovered, and they would set in motion a revolution in human thinking about death that would last for 3 millennia. The discovery of these texts is a story in itself. Fast forward 4,000 years. The year is now 1881. A French archaeologist named Gaston Maspero is working at Saqqara, the vast necropolis that served ancient Memphis. The Great Pyramids of Giza are famous throughout the world, but the smaller pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs have received far less attention. Most scholars assume they are empty, tombs looted centuries ago by grave robbers who stripped them of anything valuable. Maspero is not so sure. He has obtained permission to excavate the Pyramid of Unas, and his workers have spent weeks clearing sand and debris from the entrance passage. Finally, they break through into the interior chambers. Maspero lights his torch and steps inside. What he sees makes him catch his breath. Every wall is covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions, columns upon columns of carefully carved text, painted in blue-green pigment that still holds its color after 43 centuries. The texts cover the burial chamber, the antechamber, the passage connecting them. Thousands upon thousands of individual hieroglyphs, each one precisely formed, each one part of an intricate system of magical protection. Maspero has discovered something unprecedented, the oldest religious writings known to exist anywhere on Earth. And as he begins the slow process of translation, he realizes that these texts reveal a world of belief far stranger and more elaborate than anyone had imagined. The spells carved into Unas's pyramid were not humble prayers asking the gods for help. They were commands, declarations of power that assumed the pharaoh's absolute right to take his place among the immortals. One spell proclaimed that the sky trembles and the earth quakes before the pharaoh when he ascends. Another declared that the king's terror is before the gods like the terror of the night sky before the earth. These were not the words of a supplicant. They were the words of a being who considered himself divine by birthright, who expected the cosmos to bend to his will simply because of who he was. But the most striking aspect of the pyramid texts was their specificity. They did not speak in vague generalities about the afterlife. They provided detailed, practical instructions for navigating a landscape that the Egyptians apparently believed was as real and as mappable as the Nile Valley itself. There were spells for crossing bodies of water in the underworld, spells for avoiding specific demons whose names and characteristics were precisely described, spells for passing through gates whose guardians demanded passwords, spells for transforming into animals, birds, even divine beings. The picture that emerged was of an afterlife that operated according to consistent rules that could be learned, mastered, and exploited by anyone with the right knowledge. The theology underlying these spells centered on two great mythological cycles that would dominate Egyptian religious thought for the next 3,000 years. The first involved Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky provided the fundamental metaphor for death and rebirth. Every morning, Ra emerged from the eastern horizon in his solar bark, a magnificent boat crewed by lesser deities who helped him navigate the celestial waters. He sailed across the sky during the day, bringing light and warmth to the world of the living. But as evening approached, the bark descended toward the western horizon, entering the underworld for its nightly journey through darkness. This was when the real drama began. In the depths of the Duat, Ra faced his eternal enemy, Apophis, a serpent of impossible size whose body could encircle the entire universe. Apophis was not merely a monster, he was the embodiment of chaos itself, the primordial force that had existed before creation and that constantly sought to return the universe to formless void. Every night, Apophis attacked the solar bark, attempting to swallow Ra and extinguish the light of existence forever. Every night, Ra and his crew fought back. The battle was desperate, violent, and never certain. The Egyptians believed that the darkness they experienced between sunset and sunrise was not merely the absence of light. It was the visible evidence of cosmic warfare. The sun might not rise tomorrow. Apophis might win. The universe might end. But every morning, Ra emerged victorious on the eastern horizon. The sun rose, creation continued, and the cycle began again. The pyramid texts promised that the dead pharaoh would join this cosmic drama. He would take his place aboard Ra's bark, sailing across the sky during the day and fighting alongside the sun god during the nightly battle against chaos. He would share in Ra's daily resurrection, emerging each dawn renewed and transformed. Death was not an ending, it was a promotion to the crew of the most important vessel in existence. The second great mythological cycle involved Osiris, and his story is one of the darkest and most compelling in all of ancient religion. Once upon a time, Osiris ruled Egypt as its first king. He was a benevolent ruler who taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, laws, religion. Under his reign, Egypt flourished. But Osiris had a brother named Seth, and Seth was consumed by jealousy. Seth devised a plan. He had a beautiful chest constructed, ornately decorated and precisely measured to fit Osiris's body exactly. At a banquet, Seth announced that he would give the chest as a gift to whoever fit inside it perfectly. Guest after guest tried, none fit. Then Osiris lay down in the chest, and it fit him like it had been made for him, because it had. The moment Osiris was inside, Seth's conspirators slammed the lid shut. They sealed it with molten lead. They threw the chest into the Nile. Osiris drowned in darkness, betrayed by his own brother, murdered by jealousy. But the story did not end there. Isis, Osiris's wife, refused to accept her husband's death. She searched throughout Egypt and beyond, following rumors and clues, until she finally found the chest where it had washed ashore in distant Byblos. She brought her husband's body back to Egypt, intending to use her magical powers to restore him to life. Seth discovered what she was doing, and this time he was not taking any chances. He found Osiris's body. He tore it into pieces. Some versions say 14 pieces, some say 16, some say 42, one for each nome of Egypt. He scattered these pieces across the entire length of the kingdom, hiding them in remote locations where Isis could never find them all. He underestimated her. Isis searched for years. She found every piece except one. The phallus had been eaten by a fish in the Nile. She reassembled her husband's body, binding the pieces together with linen bandages. She used her magic to create a replacement for the missing part. And then she did something that should have been impossible. She brought him back. Not fully, not permanently. Osiris could not return to rule the living world. But Isis restored him long enough for one crucial act. She conceived a child with her resurrected husband, a son named Horus, who would grow up to avenge his father and reclaim the throne of Egypt from his treacherous uncle. As for Osiris himself, he descended to the underworld. But not as a victim, as a king. He became the ruler of the dead, the lord of the Duat, the judge before whom every soul would eventually stand. His resurrection was incomplete by the standards of the living, but it established the template for all human hopes of life after death. If Osiris could be torn apart and reassembled, if Osiris could die and yet continue to exist, then perhaps the same was possible for human beings who followed his example. The pyramid texts wove these two mythological cycles together with remarkable sophistication. The dead pharaoh would simultaneously be Ra during the day and Osiris during the night. He would sail across the sky and rule the underworld. He would fight chaos and judge the dead. The boundaries between different forms of divine existence were fluid, and the properly prepared soul could flow between them according to need. But here is the crucial point that separated ancient Egypt from almost every other religious tradition in human history. This was not faith, this was technology. The Egyptians did not believe that the afterlife rewarded the pious or the virtuous or the faithful. They believed that the afterlife rewarded the prepared. The spells carved into Unis's pyramid were not expressions of hope. They were tools, implements designed to accomplish specific tasks in a dangerous environment. A spell for transforming into a falcon was not a prayer asking the gods to grant transformation. It was an instruction manual for operating the transformation mechanism that existed in the supernatural realm. This technological approach to death had profound implications. It meant that survival in the afterlife was, at least in theory, a solvable problem. If you knew the right words, the right names, the right procedures, you could navigate the underworld successfully regardless of how you had lived your earthly life. The afterlife was not a moral judgment. It was an obstacle course. And the pyramid texts were the map. Of course, there was one significant limitation. Only pharaohs had access to this map. The spells in Unis's pyramid were carved for him alone. His name appeared throughout the texts, linking the magical formulas specifically to his soul. No one else could use them. No one else was meant to. The elaborate theological system that promised eternal life to Egypt's divine rulers offered nothing comparable to everyone else. A farmer who died during the Old Kingdom period might receive a simple burial with a few grave goods. Perhaps some bread and beer for the journey, perhaps a basic amulet for protection. But the comprehensive magical arsenal that could guarantee safe passage through the Duat remained the absolute monopoly of royalty. The masses could only hope that the pharaoh's successful transformation into an immortal being would somehow benefit them indirectly, perhaps by maintaining the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the crops growing. This arrangement held for centuries. Pharaoh after pharaoh was buried with the pyramid texts protecting their souls. Teti, Pepi I, Merenra, Pepi II. Each pyramid contained its own version of the spells, with additions and modifications reflecting evolving theological understanding. By the end of the 6th dynasty, the corpus had grown to include over 700 distinct formulas, creating the most comprehensive magical library the ancient world had ever seen. And then, everything fell apart. Around 2181 BC, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The causes were multiple and complex. A series of low Nile floods devastated agriculture. The central government's authority weakened as provincial governors accumulated power. Foreign peoples pressed against Egypt's borders. The final pharaohs of the Sixth Dynasty were weak rulers who could not maintain control over a fragmenting kingdom. Within a generation, Egypt descended into chaos. Historians call this era the First Intermediate Period, but that clinical term obscures the human reality of what happened. Civil war, famine, the complete breakdown of social order. Provincial governors who had once served the pharaoh as loyal administrators declared themselves independent rulers and fought each other for territory. The Great Pyramids of Giza stood silent over a land that had forgotten how to build anything. The religious implications of this collapse were profound. The entire theological system of the Old Kingdom had been built on the premise that the pharaoh was a living god whose power maintained cosmic order. When pharaohs proved unable to prevent famine, when they lost control of their own kingdom, when they were murdered by rivals and their tombs looted by thieves, the premise collapsed. If the gods could not protect their own earthly representative, then perhaps mortals needed to find other ways to secure their eternal survival. The crack in the theological monopoly started small. In the rock-cut tombs of Middle Egypt, wealthy provincial officials began including inscriptions that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. They copied spells from the pyramid texts. Not on pyramid walls, obviously. They did not have the resources or authority to build pyramids. But they could commission elaborate wooden coffins, and they could have those coffins covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that borrowed the magical formulas once reserved for kings. A provincial governor named Khnumhotep had spells painted on his coffin that proclaimed him divine, that promised him a place among the stars, that gave him the same magical powers that Pharaoh Unas had claimed for himself for centuries earlier. Khnumhotep was not a god. He was not even royalty. He was an administrator, a bureaucrat. Yet here he was, claiming the same eternal privileges that had once belonged exclusively to the most powerful beings on earth. The scribes who created these coffin inscriptions faced a significant challenge. The pyramid texts had been composed specifically for divine pharaohs. The spells assumed that the deceased already possessed inherent godhood. They described the dead king taking his rightful place among celestial powers who were, in a sense, his peers. How could these same spells be adapted for people who were not divine by nature? The solution was surprisingly simple. Wherever the original spell mentioned the pharaoh by name, the scribes substituted the name of the coffin's owner. Wherever the spell referred to the king's inherent divinity, they added magical formulas that would transform the ordinary dead person into a divine being. The technology of eternal life, it turned out, could be retrofitted for non-royal users. But the scribes went further than simple adaptation. They created entirely new spells to address challenges that royal theology had never needed to consider. How could a former merchant gain admission to divine councils that might refuse entry to anyone who was not already a god? How could an ex-farmer acquire the food and drink necessary for eternal sustenance? How could someone who had lived an ordinary life protect themselves against demons who might view their presence in the afterlife as an intrusion? These new spells, combined with adapted versions of the pyramid texts, became known to modern scholars as the coffin texts, and their development marked the beginning of a profound democratization of Egyptian death magic that would continue for the next 1500 years. The coffin texts did more than just extend magical protection to non-royal Egyptians. They transformed the conceptual geography of the afterlife itself. The pyramid texts had focused primarily on the celestial realm, with the dead pharaoh rising to take his place among the stars or sailing across the sky with Ra. The coffin texts shifted attention downward, toward the underworld and its landscapes. For the first time, detailed descriptions appeared of the field of reeds, Seket Aru, the agricultural paradise where the blessed dead would spend eternity. Earlier texts had mentioned this place only in passing. The coffin texts turned it into a fully realized landscape with precise measurements and specific characteristics. The field of reeds measured exactly 1,000 by 1,000 cubits, about 300 meters on each side. A perfect square of supernatural farmland divided into distinct regions. The eastern portion contained barley that grew to heights of 4 cubits, taller than any barley on earth. The western portion produced emmer wheat reaching 7 cubits. Between these agricultural zones flowed canals carrying the waters of a celestial Nile that never failed, fed by sources connected to the primordial waters from which all creation had emerged. The texts provided detailed sailing directions for navigating these waterways. They named the ferrymen who controlled passage between different regions. They specified the exact words required to secure those ferrymen's cooperation. This was practical information, the kind of guidance a traveler would need in an unfamiliar country. The afterlife had become a place that could be learned. But the most revolutionary innovation of the coffin texts was the introduction of moral judgment. The pyramid texts had assumed the pharaoh's automatic righteousness. The king did not need to justify his worthiness because his divine nature placed him beyond evaluation. He was good by definition. Whatever he had done during his earthly reign, however many people he had killed in war or worked to death building monuments, none of that mattered. He was a god. Gods do not answer to human moral standards. The democratization of death magic changed this calculus. If ordinary people could now access the afterlife, there needed to be some mechanism for determining which ones deserved the privilege. The solution was a new category of spell that required the deceased to declare their innocence of specific transgressions before divine judges. These declarations of innocence, which scholars would later call the negative confession, appeared scattered throughout various coffin text spells. I have not committed evil against men. I have not mistreated animals. I have not committed sins in the place of truth. I have not known what should not be known. The deceased would recite these denials while standing before assemblies of gods who possessed the power to grant or deny access to paradise. The specific sins mentioned in these early confessions revealed Middle Kingdom Egyptian values with remarkable clarity. The prohibited actions included not just obvious crimes like murder and theft, but subtle social transgressions. Gossiping about superiors, showing disrespect to parents, cheating in business measurements, displaying arrogance toward social inferiors. Proper behavior in Egyptian society meant maintaining harmony within a strictly hierarchical system. The same behaviors that made someone a good Egyptian citizen during life would qualify them for a reward after death. This was the moment when Egyptian religion stopped being purely technological and started becoming moral. The afterlife was still an obstacle course that could be navigated with the right knowledge. But now there was an additional requirement. You also had to be able to claim convincingly that you had lived a decent life. The coffins themselves became extraordinary artifacts. Wealthy officials of the Middle Kingdom commissioned sarcophagi that transformed wooden boxes into complete magical environments. The interior lid might feature astronomical diagrams showing the constellation pattern the deceased would navigate toward. The walls contained spells organized according to the sequence in which they would be needed during the posthumous journey. The floor often displayed maps of the underworld with labeled pathways and landmarks. The coffin became a three-dimensional book, a portable guide to everything a soul needed to know. The artistic workshops that produced these coffins developed sophisticated techniques for maximizing the magical content that could fit within limited space. Scribes used abbreviated hieroglyphic forms. They developed new layouts that allowed multiple columns of text to occupy surfaces that would previously have held only simple decorative patterns. Quality control became a significant concern. Errors in magical texts could have catastrophic consequences for the deceased. Wealthy patrons demanded accuracy. Workshops implemented proofreading procedures in which master scribes reviewed completed coffins line by line, comparing them against authoritative templates and correcting mistakes before delivery. The personalization of these inscriptions reached extraordinary levels. Individual coffins might contain unique spells composed specifically for their owners, incorporating personal names, family relationships, and professional accomplishments into traditional magical formulas. A military commander might receive specialized protection against demons associated with battlefield death. A priest could access exclusive spells for maintaining divine favor. A scribe might possess formulas emphasizing the continuation of intellectual work beyond death. The economics of coffin production created new industries throughout Middle Egypt. Specialized scriptoriums employed teams of scribes who could rapidly produce personalized magical texts for wealthy clients. Woodworkers developed techniques for creating coffins whose surfaces could accommodate maximum inscription density. Paint makers refined pigments that would remain vivid for centuries. A supply chain emerged to support what was becoming, for the first time in history, a consumer market for death magic. When Egypt was reunited under the Theban pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom around 2055 BC, the democratization process had already acquired unstoppable momentum. The new rulers could not put the genie back in the bottle. Provincial nobles had grown accustomed to claiming afterlife privileges that their ancestors would never have dared to assert. Wealthy merchants and skilled professionals had joined the market for magical protection. The theological monopoly of the Old Kingdom was shattered beyond repair. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs adapted by emphasizing their special relationship with Osiris rather than trying to restrict access to afterlife magic entirely. The god of the dead became increasingly central to royal ideology. Abydos, where Osiris was believed to be buried, became the most important pilgrimage site in Egypt. Kings built cenotaphs there. Private individuals commissioned stelae that would allow their souls to participate eternally in the festivals honoring the resurrected god. For nearly 4 centuries, the Middle Kingdom flourished. And then, around 1650 BC, disaster struck again. A foreign people called the Hyksos, whose name meant rulers of foreign lands, seized control of northern Egypt. They established their capital at Avaris in the Nile Delta and ruled as pharaohs for over a century, while native Egyptian dynasties maintained precarious independence in the south. The second intermediate period was less catastrophic than the first. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian customs and maintained existing administrative structures. But the psychological impact of foreign rule was profound. The failure of Egyptian kings to protect their own country raised the same theological questions that the collapse of the Old Kingdom had raised 5 centuries earlier. If divine kingship could not prevent conquest by foreigners, perhaps individuals needed to take even greater responsibility for their own eternal fate. When the Theban pharaoh Ahmose finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BC and established the 18th dynasty, he inaugurated what historians call the New Kingdom. This was Egypt's imperial age. Over the next 5 centuries, Egyptian armies would conquer territories stretching from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Wealth flowed into the Nile Valley on an unprecedented scale. A prosperous middle class emerged, composed of administrators, merchants, skilled artisans, and military officers who possessed both the resources and the aspiration to secure magical protection for their eternal souls. The coffin texts had made death magic accessible to the wealthy, but coffins were still expensive. The elaborate wooden sarcophagi covered with personalized inscriptions required significant investment in skilled labor and quality materials. Many members of the new middle class could not afford them. The solution was a technological innovation that would revolutionize the death magic industry: papyrus scrolls. Papyrus had been used for writing since the Old Kingdom, but its application to funerary texts posed challenges. Coffin inscriptions carved into wood could theoretically last forever. Papyrus buried in tomb conditions faced threats from moisture, insects, and simple deterioration. If a scroll disintegrated before the deceased needed its spells, the magical protection would be worthless at precisely the moment it mattered most. Egyptian craftsmen solved these problems through innovations in papyrus preparation. The finest scrolls destined for tomb use were manufactured from premium quality plants, with strips carefully selected for uniformity and strength. Extended soaking removed organic impurities. Pressing techniques created exceptionally dense sheets resistant to moisture. Multiple layers were laminated with adhesives that included compounds believed to enhance supernatural durability. The writing materials also evolved. Standard carbon ink worked fine for administrative documents, but scribes developed enhanced formulations for eternal magical protection. Powdered minerals, precious metals, ritually consecrated organic compounds. Gold ink became prized for the most important spells, as the incorruptible metal was believed to imbue texts with solar power that would remain effective forever. The real advantage of papyrus scrolls was their flexibility. Coffin inscriptions had been constrained by the physical surfaces of wooden sarcophagi. Spells had to be fitted into available spaces without necessarily following logical sequences. Papyrus scrolls could be organized according to the actual structure of the afterlife journey. Spells could be arranged in the order they would be needed. Related formulas could be grouped together. Cross-references could connect different sections. This organizational freedom led to the development of standardized spell collections. Scribes selected the most effective formulas from the vast corpus of coffin texts, while adding new spells designed for the changing religious landscape of the new kingdom. The resulting collections varied in length and content depending on what customers could afford, but they followed recognizable patterns. Modern scholars would eventually assign chapter numbers to these standardized spells for reference purposes, creating the organizational framework by which the Book of the Dead is studied today. The House of Life institutions played crucial roles in this standardization process. These ancient scriptoriums, attached to major temples throughout Egypt, functioned as combination libraries, schools, and publishing houses. The House of Life at Memphis maintained strong connections to Old Kingdom traditions, producing scrolls that emphasized solar theology and stellar transformation. The House of Life at Thebes reflected the political prominence of the New Kingdom capital, creating elaborate illustrated manuscripts that featured the judgment scene before Osiris. The House of Life at Hermopolis developed its own distinctive approach, emphasizing comprehensive textual coverage over artistic display. These institutions trained the scribes who would produce funerary papyri for the commercial market. Apprentices learned not just writing techniques, but theological knowledge, artistic conventions, and quality control procedures. The most talented could eventually establish independent workshops, creating the first mass market for religious texts in human history. The economics were remarkable. A basic scroll containing the most essential spells might cost the equivalent of a few months' wages for a skilled worker. Expensive, but achievable for a middle-class family that saved carefully. A comprehensive scroll with full-color illustrations by master artists might cost as much as a house. The range of options allowed Egyptians across a wide economic spectrum to obtain some level of magical protection. The most famous example of a high-end New Kingdom scroll belonged to a scribe named Ani. His papyrus, now in the British Museum, measures over 78 feet long, and features some of the finest painted vignettes ever produced in ancient Egypt. The judgment scene alone is a masterpiece, showing Ani and his wife standing before the scales while Anubis weighs his heart and Thoth records the verdict. Ammit crouches beneath the balance, waiting. The 42 judges sit in rows along the top of the scene, each one rendered as an individual deity with distinctive animal head and specific attribute. Ani was not a pharaoh. He was not even nobility. He was a bureaucrat, a scribe in the temple of Ammonius at Thebes. But his scroll gave him access to magical protection that the mightiest kings of the Old Kingdom would have envied. 3,000 years of theological evolution had transformed death magic from royal monopoly to consumer product. Now let me take you through what Ani believed would happen to him after death. Not the abstract theological principles, the actual experience, as the Egyptians imagined it, from the moment of death to the gates of paradise. Ani dies. His heart stops beating in his house in Thebes. His family summons the embalmers, who will spend the next 70 days transforming his corpse into a mummy that can serve as an eternal home for his returning soul. But his soul does not wait for this process. The moment of death is also the moment of departure. Ani finds himself standing in darkness. Not ordinary darkness, a darkness so profound that it seems to have weight and texture. He can feel it pressing against him. His body is different now, lighter, more flexible. He still looks like himself, but he is made of something other than flesh. He knows what he must do. He has spent his entire adult life studying for this moment. He has memorized spells. He has rehearsed transformations. He has practiced the words he will need to speak to survive the next 12 hours. 12 hours that will determine whether he spends eternity in paradise or ceases to exist entirely. He begins to walk. There is a direction, somehow, even in this absolute darkness. A pull toward something. The entrance to the Duat. The western gate materializes before him. Two massive pillars flanking an opening that leads into deeper darkness. But the pillars are not stone. They are serpents. Enormous cobras whose coiled bodies form the gateway's frame, whose heads rise above the opening and watch with eyes that glow with inner fire. These are the watchers of the gate. They will not let him pass unless he proves he has the right to enter the realm of the dead. And the proof they require is knowledge. Ani speaks. His voice sounds strange in his own ears, thinner, more resonant, but the words are correct. He has practiced them 1,000 times. I am the son of Ra, who emerges from the horizon. I know the hidden names of the powers who dwell in the Duat. I come bearing the seal of Thoth, who records all truth. Open for me, O watchers. Open for me the gates of the western mountain. The serpent's eyes flare brighter. For a terrible moment, Ani thinks he has made a mistake, mispronounced a word, forgotten a phrase. The jaws open wider. Then, they move aside. The gates open, and Ani steps through into the underworld. The Book of the Dead was not a factual description of what lay beyond death. It was a best guess, a carefully considered hypothesis based on centuries of religious reflection, a map of territory that no living person had visited. But it was also something more. It was a refusal to surrender to meaninglessness. The Egyptians understood something that modern psychology has rediscovered. Human beings need narratives. We need stories that make sense of our lives, that give purpose to our struggles, that connect our individual existence to something larger than ourselves. Without such narratives, we fall into despair. The Book of the Dead provided the ultimate narrative. It told Egyptians that their lives mattered, that their choices had consequences extending beyond death, that their relationships with loved ones could continue forever. that the universe was not indifferent to their existence but had prepared a place for them in its eternal structure. The sun is setting over the Nile as it has every evening for millions of years. Somewhere beneath the western horizon, if you believed the Egyptians, the solar bark is beginning its descent into the underworld. Ra is preparing for battle. The gods are taking their stations, and the souls of the blessed dead are rising from their rest in the field of reeds to join the crew. The Egyptians would tell us to live as if we will be judged, to build hearts that can balance against the feather of truth, to become souls that deserve eternity. Whether or not they were right about what awaits us, that seems like good advice. The sun is setting. The journey continues. And somewhere, perhaps, the scales are waiting. Sleep well.